welcome to Post Games, a podcast about how and why we love video games. I am your host, Chris Plant, and I am so happy to have you here. But before we get into today's episode, I want to ask you a quick favor. You see, in 2026, Post Games is my full-time job, which means the show's success depends on listeners like you. Now, I profoundly appreciate folks who support the show on Patreon, and if you have been considering subscribing, now is a perfect time. But if you enjoy the free version of the show, that is totally cool too. There are still two easy, no-money things that you can do that will keep this show running for years to come. Number one, leave a review, preferably on Apple Podcast. I know it is a bit grating to hear this on every podcast that you listen to, but it really does impact a show's visibility. Leaving a review takes a minute, but those reviews, when taken all together, make a long-term impact. And number two, the other thing that you can do is share the show with a friend, maybe on social media, maybe on a group text. Have a favorite episode, share it with someone. You do those two things, and you help keep Post Games nice and fueled for the year to come. On with the show. Gamers just treat Nintendo differently. Where its contemporaries, Sony and Xbox, are viewed as cynical corporate machines, Nintendo is often described as a benevolent force, floating above the popular culture, occasionally raining fresh entries of beloved franchises like Zelda and Mario onto the fields of parched players. Sure, fans and press will grumble over the quality of the latest Pokemon games or the ceaseless legal efforts to shut down ROM websites, but rarely, if ever, do Nintendo's actions inspire expansive boycotts, nor do we see Shuntaro Furukawa, the sixth and current president of Nintendo, in headlines on gaming news sites that will gleefully slide CEOs like Strauss Zelnick, Tim Sweeney, and Phil Spencer onto a skewer to roast over open flame. This rarefied status wasn't given, but earned. Nintendo's leaders have, for decades, been careful to guarantee its reputation as a company by prioritizing the reputation of its art. Which is to say, for as long as Nintendo's been in the business of making games, its various leaders have shared in the opinion that the best way to protect their station at the top of Mount Video Game is A. Cancel bad games, B. Ship good games, and C. Protect the value of what does reach the market by rarely lowering its price, suggesting, through the market itself, that Nintendo games aren't like other games. Nor is Nintendo like other game makers. The company has been so successful at constructing and maintaining this merry monolithic image and so secretive about its internal workings that most people forget that it is a company at all. Of course, it is a company, one run by brilliant but fallible artists and business people. It has a ruddy and tangled history. Its employees, even the most famous and idolized, make mistakes. Super Nintendo, the game-changing company that unlocked the power of play by Keza MacDonald, is a new history of Nintendo available on February 3rd, so you can pre-order now, that does the deceptively bold act of showing how a mix of unusual corporate moves, intergenerational friendships, and even some luck laid the foundation for the Nintendo we know today. We don't have Nintendo without a young CEO who fired employees who questioned his ambitions, including his own family rivals. Nor do we have Nintendo without illicit card games, love hotels, a taxi company, and a factory line repair person who, in a fit of boredom, imagines a toy that would change the company's focus and its fortunes. This history, it matters. Not to tear down Nintendo, but to help us learn how it was made to begin with. How can other game makers construct themselves in its style? And how might future caretakers not merely maintain the structure of Nintendo, but adapt the company to a rapidly changing culture, one that has way more in common with the uncertain video game experimentation of the 1990s? Keza MacDonald joins us to share that history and the lessons that can be gleaned from it. This week on Post Games, the untold history of Nintendo. Act 1, how Nintendo became a game company. Act 2, Nintendo's present. A Patreon bonus, the future of Nintendo. Keza sticks around to talk about where this company is going, considering it will soon be without all of the big names that made it what it is today. And Act 3, as always, the news of the week. Let's get to it. It is a new year and you want to eat better, but you still have no time to work with. You have no energy. You have so much going on in your life. What do? You do Factor. 2 minutes, real food, and you are done. You're not failing at eating healthy. You're failing at having 3 extra hours in every night. You're failing at not being a chef and wanting to do cleanup. Factor takes care of that. It has delicious food that is good for you. You got lean proteins, colorful veggies, whole food ingredients, and none of the yucky stuff, no refined sugars, no artificial sweeteners. It will offer you whatever you need to match your lifestyle. For me, Mediterranean diet, it really works well. But maybe you need something else, like a high-protein diet or GLP-1 support or ready-to-eat salads. Whatever it is, Factor wants to meet you on your page. Always fresh, never frozen, and like I said, ready in 2 minutes with no prep, no cleanup, just chill. I use Factor. I think that you should too. Head to factormeals.com/postgames, 50 off, and use code postgames50 off to get 50% off your first Factor box, plus free breakfast for a year. Offer only valid for new Factor customers with code and qualifying auto-renewing subscriptions purchase. Make healthier eating easy with Factor. Act 1. How Nintendo became a game company. Keza MacDonald is the rarest of things in video game journalism, a veteran with an editor role at a major newspaper. Keza has been reporting on games for 20 years, beginning in 2006 at Eurogamer with features and reviews. Since 2018, she has worked at The Guardian, where she serves as the video games editor. Through that role, she has introduced hundreds of thousands of readers to the wider gaming culture through original reporting, enlightening reviews, and deep analysis. In recent years, MacDonald has been penning this massive history of Nintendo, cleverly dubbed Super Nintendo. The book chronicles the history of the Japanese company from Hanafuda cards to the Nintendo Switch, including deep dives into the creation of beloved series like Mario, Zelda, and Metroid. What differentiates this Nintendo history from so many contemporaries is MacDonald's access. The book, featuring interviews from practically every major living member of the Nintendo team, including Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto, whom MacDonald interviewed inside Nintendo's HQ, a place that very few Western journalists ever crossed the threshold. We open with a conversation about Nintendo's decades before video games, when a young CEO broke with the national corporate norms and bet big on toys. From there, we talk about the creation of modern Nintendo, a somewhat silly term, in that it dates back to the 1980s. And eventually, we get to the company's future, which is, for the first time in a long time, uncertain. It's another big, meaty convo, so let's dive right in. While researching the book, what were the earliest details that you were able to find out about Nintendo?
The first person I spoke to about Nintendo's earliest days was a French guy called Fabrice, who is a collector of Nintendo's earliest artifacts. So not just its playing cards, which were, of course, the first things that Nintendo ever made, but also every magazine or newspaper that he could find that had any mention of Nintendo, any advert, any interview, anything at all, he would pull that and collect that as well. So he, in his back garden, has a one-to-one recreation of the very, very first Nintendo headquarters from 1889 in France, in his back garden in Alsace. So he was the first guy that I talked to about Nintendo's earliest days. So oddly, my understanding of Nintendo's origins were fleshed out thanks to a French guy.
Where does someone get the idea to build, like recreate a building?
I think one of the best things about writing about video games for so long is you meet so many wonderful kinds of nerd, right? So many people who have these like extremely particular passions, which I just love it. I absolutely love it. And yeah, Fabrice he started out playing Nintendo games as a kid, like many of us did, but then he became really obsessed with Nintendo's earliest history. And so he tracked down photographs of this little wooden building in a Kyoto backstreet from the 1800s. From there, he took the plans that he could find of Kyoto from Kyoto City Hall to see what dimensions must have been. He found a particular kind of woodworker who would do the right kind of timber for it. He found a guy who would do the right sort of Japanese-inspired slate for the roof. And then he got someone to go to Kyoto and stand there and try and measure physically exactly the dimensions of the thing to try and get it to be as accurate recreation as possible of this little building. So if you really want to see Nintendo's very, very earliest origins, you're probably better off going to Alsace than going to Kyoto, because that street where Nintendo's first headquarters is long, long since gone. The new things that are there are much, much different from how it would have looked in the late 19th century.
I love when you talk about this in the book, because you also mention the sign for Nintendo on this building, in that despite us knowing so much about this company, despite its historic importance, the kanji, there's no, I guess, true or officially known meaning of the kanji. Can you explain what the issue there is?
The earliest thing we still have from Nintendo, because that first building's gone now, the earliest thing we still have is the plaque from the second headquarters, which is in a nearby street in Kyoto. And I'm not sure if it's the original plaque or a modern recreation of it, but outside a hotel called the Marufukuro now, there is a plaque that says Nintendo with those kanji. And that there's a lot of theories about what Nintendo mean, but as a sequence of letters, as a sequence of meanings, they don't mean any one particular thing. And the original meaning, the intended meaning, has been lost to time. No one at Nintendo knows it. Miyamoto doesn't know it. It's quite possible that the Yamauchi family at one point might have known it, but they don't know it now. So the meaning of Nintendo, there's a phrase that means something to do with luck. It's leave luck to heaven, something along those lines, which is now kind of popularly accepted. And if you ask people at Nintendo, they will say, we don't know, but that's a reasonable assumption. But there's no one person, no historian, no one at Nintendo, nobody in the Yamauchi family who truly knows what those three kanji originally meant, which I think is just fascinating.
Okay. You mentioned the Yamauchi family. I want to dig into the Yamauchis, specifically Hiroshi Yamauchi. Now, a bunch of people who listen to this show, they're probably familiar with Satoru Iwata, who is the late president of Nintendo, who would appear in Nintendo Directs, who just seemed very lovable, would have these quotes like, on my business card, I'm a corporate president. In my mind, I'm a game developer, but in my heart, I'm a gamer. Before him is Hiroshi Yamauchi, who is responsible, as you describe in the book, for transitioning Nintendo from a card game maker to a video game maker. It is very different than Iwata, something I did not appreciate until I read your book. Can you kind of talk about this person who seemed very tough and unsentimental? And then we'll go from there, because I have a few more questions about him. How was he as a person?
It's very interesting when you look at Japanese business culture, because an awful lot of businesses, like big businesses, are still family owned. And like right back to even samurai culture, it was the idea of there being a family. And people would get adopted into these families who weren't, like sons-in-law would get adopted into these families. So the Yamauchi family started out with Fusajiro Yamauchi, who's the founder of Nintendo, the card game maker. And then his son basically just pieced out. He left Kyoto and wasn't anything to do with Nintendo. And then it was Fusajiro's grandson in the end, who ends up, Hiroshi Yamauchi, who ends up running Nintendo. And he takes over shortly after the Second World War is over. And he's a very young man. And this is a traditional business culture in which you do not get very young men in their 20s running companies. So the first thing that happens when Hiroshi Yamauchi takes over from his grandfather is that the staff have a bit of a revolt and they all decide they're not going to take this. And he fires every single one of them, which, again, completely unheard of. Well, not completely unheard of, but very unusual in that business culture of that time for a young person to come in and just get rid of all that institutional knowledge. And he also got rid of every other relative from the Yamauchi family. So there was a cousin, there was an uncle. He got rid of all of them. None of them have anything to do with the business so that his authority would be completely unquestionable at the company. Which, you know, it's a fairly military way, isn't it? It's like a coup. It's like a royal family.
I mean, it's Shakespearean.
Yeah, it's stunning. And because there's not a lot of people around who are still with us who knew Yamauchi as a young man, all we have to go from are these facts of what happened. And most of the people who we know who did spend time with Yamauchi while he was still alive are people like Henk Rogers, who was a friend of his, who was the guy who brought Tetris out of the Soviet Union and into the wider world. And he's described as this very severe character. He had a passion for the game of Go, the Eastern version of chess, I guess. He didn't play video games. He didn't have much of a, you know, he wasn't particularly fussed about video games as an art form. He was fussed about video games as a business. But he was always described as this very authoritarian guy.
The original Strauss Zelnick.
He was like, I think, you know, if he were around today, he'd be like a proper business patriarch, or the kind that you kind of don't get anymore. Like, for a company that is in the business of fun, to be run by such a severe individual is so funny to me. There's a real contrast between the playfulness of Nintendo as a company as we know it and the very authoritarian way in which Yamauchi ran it in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s.
He ends up making a hire that seems like the transition point between himself and the Miyamoto era, and that is Gunpei Yokoi. Can you tell people who this person is and why he is so essential to the Nintendo story?
So at the time when Hiroshi Yamauchi takes over, Nintendo is a small playing card company in Kyoto. That's all it does. And they're mostly making Hanafuda cards at that point. Now, the context of Nintendo's transformation is that this is the Meiji period. And previous to this, there's been a very, very strict anti-gambling series of laws in Japan. And now that is being relaxed, as are a couple of other strict laws about what's allowed to be manufactured. So that permits Nintendo to start making Western-style playing cards, which in Japan were known as trump cards. So Yamauchi starts making Western-style decks of cards with things like Disney characters on and other little tie-ins like that, and starts marketing these cards instead of something that's about gambling and that has kind of associations with the Yakuza and organized crime. Yamauchi's Nintendo starts marketing these cards as family-friendly games. And the card decks come with like little leaflets with things that you can play. They also manufacture cards that help kids learn their Japanese alphabet. They're manufacturing cards that are a poetry game that you play called, I think, Yakuban Isshin, where you have to match up phrases of poetry together. So it's kind of becoming more of a family-friendly company at that point. And then there's this period where they do all sorts of things. Famously, they very briefly got into love hotels, which are, you know, by the hour, by the night hotels in Japan.
And this is about the 50s, 60s when they're starting to do that?
That's right. So the 50s and 60s, it's taxis. They were into taxis for a bit. They were into rice distribution for a little while. Yamauchi's got a great eye for business, and he's made a lot of money making playing cards. So he's looking for the next thing. And that is when Nintendo started getting into toys. And one person was really instrumental in Nintendo's transformation into a toy maker, which was Gunpei Yokoi. He was hired as an engineer to fix the machines that made the playing cards. So he was working on the manufacturing line. And because that was quite a boring job, he would create things to entertain himself. And one of those things was this extendable concertina-like grabber toy, which Yamauchi noticed when making the rounds of the factory once. And he picked Yokoi off the line and said, I want you to make this into a product that we can make. And they did. And it was the Ultra Hand, which is a grabber toy. And they sold 1 million of them. So at that point, Yokoi stops being the guy that fixes the card machines and starts being a guy who's in charge of research and development for toys. And that's a very important moment for Nintendo.
That little moment is so interesting to me because Gunpei Yokoi is on this production line, basically, just fiddling around and make something quite strange and goofy, this grabby toy. I believe you even wrote that he didn't even really see it necessarily as a product.
Not at all.
On the flip side, you have Yamauchi, who, again, severe, not fun, but has the ability to know what fun is and what fun sells. And these two people needing each other. And we'll get to this more as we go on. But throughout the Nintendo story, that continues to happen, where any one of them would not work. But when they come together, they happen to be in the right place, is what ends up making this company. It's really quite incredible. I want to go into a famous Yokoi quote that you cite in the book. And it actually comes from his own book from, I believe, 1997. And he talked about lateral thinking with withered technology as fundamental to his creative approach. I think anybody who's attended a game developer conference is maybe already familiar with this, maybe less so beyond that world. Can you explain what Yokoi meant by this and why it was so foundational?
So Yokoi was trained as an engineer and he was a tinkerer. So his way of doing things was to take stuff that already existed and make it work in a new way. He wasn't an inventor necessarily in terms of like a technological inventor. He wasn't particularly interested in entirely new technologies. He was interested in how you can use the materials and technologies that you already have in a way that is different or more fun. So a good example of this, of course, is the Game Boy, which is his most famous invention. And the Game Boy was really technically underpowered, even for the 1980s. It was hilariously underpowered as a piece of technology, but it was built in such a way creatively so as to make it do great things with a tiny little black and white, well, green and black screen and a few batteries. And it was relatively cheap to manufacture. It was, high profit margin. And anyone who's familiar with Nintendo is probably recognizing this way of doing things, right? It's never the cutting edge technologically. It's about using the tech that you already have in a way that makes you smile or that is unexpected. And also, very importantly, that also has a high profit margin because you're using older materials and technology. So this way of doing things still is very much a part of how Nintendo operates. And yeah, it's that, interestingly with that quote, it's really hard to trace that back to its origin.
Yeah.
Because it's a quote we've all heard, right? If you cover games or if you've ever been to the Game Developer Conference, you'll have heard that lateral thinking with withered technology phrase. And I spent a long time trying to firstly figure out what it was in Japanese and then figure out where it came from and then find a copy of the book so that I could make absolutely sure that it was actually said by Gunpei Yokoi. Because, of course, sometimes with these quotes, they end up being essentially fabrications or embellishments or whatever else. So I have now found the page of the book, this really difficult to find book, that has that particular quote on it. But yeah, I think that it's very interesting to me that a principle that first involved things like light guns and board games and silly toys and extendable concertina grabbers, that same philosophy is now applied to the Nintendo Switch, Joy-Con, and the alarm clock that Nintendo made and everything else that the company does. It's still this idea of working with what you've got technologically, but making it really fun. And I think another really great encapsulation of that is Nintendo Labo. Like, they're working with cardboard, which is surely the most withered technology imaginable, apart from perhaps the wheel or fire. And they've made cardboard fun. They've made cardboard feel new and exciting. And I think that's a really great expression of the Nintendo creative philosophy.
That's such a great way of putting it. Yes, nothing more withered than the thing that is now sitting in the rain outside my house because it was containing Christmas toys. The third person that's going to get us to modern Nintendo is, of course, Shigeru Miyamoto. Yamauchi is raw business. Gunpei is kind of business meets technology. Miyamoto is the designer. At one point in the book, you talk about how Miyamoto hoped that all of the money coming in for these other things could maybe afford him some space to just tinker with game making, which is such I think everyone's fantasy. I did not fully appreciate how much of a mentor Yokoi was to Miyamoto. So I'd love if you could explain what Yokoi saw in Miyamoto, what attracted him to this young designer.
So often in companies all over the world at this time, there's this idea of craftsmanship being a skill that you pass down through your apprentices and mentorship. So if you were working in a ceramics factory in Germany or something like that, then you would probably also have a person who was training you in the art of what you were doing. And Nintendo very much operated in this way. It operated like the craftsmanship was passed down. And that started out with the cards, obviously, printing of Hanafuda. It still works this way now, actually. But when Miyamoto was brought on, he was placed under Yokoi. And Yokoi would have had several people under him who he was kind of personally responsible for. And there's kind of a two-way relationship. It wasn't quite hierarchical, but there was always been a sort of two-way relationship between that person who's got the institutional knowledge, who's kind of in charge of the team, and then the people below who would have ideas. And then between those two, great things would sometimes come out of the combination of the experience and the knowledge and then the ideas from the younger people. That's still how they make games. And Miyamoto was hired because I think his father knew someone who knew Hiroshi Yamauchi. And so Miyamoto kind of got an interview. But Miyamoto I get the impression he was kind of dossing about a bit after university. I get the impression no one had high hopes for the guy. You know, he wanted to be a comic artist. He seems to have had the classic game developer story of slightly baffled, disappointed parents. He spent a lot of time in arcades as a student. And when I talked to him about his very early days at Nintendo, he said that he wanted to make something unusual and interesting. And a lot of he studied industrial design at university. So a lot of his classmates were going to work for what he called proper companies, like Sharp or, other companies that made electronics and things like that. And he wanted to make something else. He wanted to make something different. And Nintendo had such a broad, random, at this point, selection of things. They did baby strollers. They did electronic toys, light guns, board games. Still, they did the cards. They did a whole bunch of things. And Nintendo had this idea, and Miyamoto had this idea that Nintendo could almost subsidize his ideas for products with, the successful, established stuff. And he told me that when he got to Nintendo, he realized that none of that was making very much money, actually, which is quite funny. And so it isn't really surprising that Nintendo in the 1970s, which is comprised of people like Gunpei Yokoi, tinkerers, engineers, toy makers, and the other electronics and mechanical engineers and people like Miyamoto who are product designers, is not surprising that this group of people, when Space Invaders came along in the late 70s, it makes perfect sense to me that this group of people would go, let's make video games, let's make arcade games, let's get into electronic entertainment. And so there was kind of a free-for-all at the beginning of this time where everyone at Nintendo was trying to come up with ideas for electronic games. And most of Nintendo's really early games weren't anything particularly interesting. They were mostly clones of things like Space Invaders that already existed. And then, of course, the breakthrough arcade hit for Nintendo is Donkey Kong, which was something that came about through a series of very interesting failures. And Miyamoto was given a chance with that. That was his first chance to create, kind of creative lead on a project. And of course, it did so well that he never had to do anything else again. He became a game designer the moment that Donkey Kong really hit the market, and he never stopped.
Let's take a quick break. And then when we come back, we'll talk about kind of the modern era of Nintendo. Act 2, Nintendo's present. Now we're talking about the present, a little bit of the future later of Nintendo. And I want to start with Iwata because even though Satoru Iwata passed away years ago, I personally think of his tenure as the beginning of modern Nintendo. Most of the present state of the company wouldn't exist without his long-term creative vision. As in, like, the Switch 2 wouldn't exist in some form without Iwata. How did Iwata's approach change Nintendo from the Yamauchi era?
So we've noticed this pattern with Nintendo where there'll be a kind of intergenerational thing going on where an older, more experienced person and a younger, more experienced person will often create a team or share experience and knowledge. And that started out with, Yamauchi, then Yokoi, then Miyamoto. And Miyamoto also mentored Eiji Aonuma, who then in turn went on to mentor Fujibayashi, who now runs Zelda. And you can always trace these kind of lines of almost a genealogy of these games through the creative leads. And you can see how knowledge and ideas kind of pass through generations of Nintendo consoles. And sometimes you can really see the fingerprints of particular people in those transitions. You can see maybe an idea happen somewhere in the early 90s, but then it'll come back. It'll come back maybe in 2014 or 2016, and you'll be like, oh, I see that. You can really make the connection. And that's one of the cool things about looking really deeply at Nintendo and how it works. And Satoru Iwata, you can see his fingerprints on basically everything Nintendo does now. And he really brought a sense of fundamental understanding of the principles of fun. Like, what is a video game? How does it work? What is it for? And for Satoru Iwata, video games were for making people happy. They were for putting smiles on faces. And this has become kind of a pat phrase for Nintendo. It's always talking about putting smiles on faces, and it's become a phrase that sort of makes you roll your eyes a little bit. But Satoru Iwata, very truly with all his heart, believed in the power of video games to bring happiness to people. And that principle really ran all the way from the DS, which was his first console that was launched under Iwata. It runs all the way through to the Switch 2 now. And the kind of principles of how the hardware makes you feel, like the sort of simple joy of just using a piece of Nintendo hardware. I think all of that comes from Iwata's principle of like, we are here to make people happy. And something that you learn about Iwata, if you talk to people who knew him or you read what people have to say about him as a person, is that he carried that principle not just as a game designer, but as a person. And it's very hard to find anybody who has a bad word to say about Satoru Iwata. He was a good friend, he was a loving father, and he was a very good business person. And even, I always assumed that there must have been a bit of a tension between Miyamoto and Iwata because they were of a similar-ish age. And in Japanese business culture, generally, if you're older, you get priority. If you've been at the company longer, you get priority. I always thought when Yamauchi picked Iwata, that must have really annoyed Miyamoto and maybe some other people at the company. But when you talk to Miyamoto about it, he was like, no, Iwata was by far the best person to run Nintendo. I was very happy making video games. I wasn't a business person. It was the guy who was best placed to run the company. And I think if he hadn't been such a kind of likable person, then maybe it would have been much more of a controversial decision for him to have been elevated to be the next president after Yamauchi.
There's a great quote that Iwata has about Miyamoto that I wanted to bring up, and that is, Miyamoto makes his games by taking leaps of faith. If we do this, here's what we can expect. In that sense, he has a much higher batting average than most, but he is not omnipotent, and he makes his fair share of mistakes. Now, this is a very beautiful quote about taking risks as a designer, and that's probably what I should ask about. But I'm not going to, because this is a rare time where you hear someone recognize that Miyamoto, the game designer, is fallible, is human. So plenty of ink has been spilled on Miyamoto's successes. What were, if any, the mistakes that you learned about that Miyamoto had made while writing this book?
Well, most of Miyamoto's mistakes never make it into a finished video game. That's actually part of his genius. Part of his genius is knowing what not to release as well as what to release. Miyamoto has killed probably hundreds of projects at Nintendo over the years, many of them his own. And one thing that you learn by really looking into how Nintendo works is that there is such a rigorous process of every single idea goes through so much before it gets even made into a prototype. Like, the reason Nintendo's batting average is so high is because only these ideas that have been through this absolute gauntlet of like 50 people all like hammering at it, only then does the idea even make it to the prototype stage. And then a prototype isn't necessarily going to make it all the way to a full game. So for every Splatoon, there's probably like 60, 70, 80 ideas. And for every one of those 60, 70, 80 ideas, there's maybe 10 prototypes. And then of those 10 prototypes, you get that one game. And that's why Nintendo's games are often, it feels like they come out of nowhere. It feels like they're so good, but they really are a process of iteration. So I think we don't see most of Miyamoto's mistakes, but Iwata did. Because Iwata worked so closely with him. The Iwata-Miyamoto relationship was an absolutely beautiful working relationship. It was a meeting of two minds with very different ways of looking at video game design and the world, but with such complementary power. And those two clearly had a very beautiful friendship, and the way they write about each other. I mean, Miyamoto always says that Iwata flattered him all the time, because Iwata always basically calls himself Miyamoto's number one disciple and fan in all the world. But he also has he was like an ardent student of Miyamoto's thinking and his game design. And Miyamoto was always like, I don't think about things as hard as you do. Like, it's like he would say that Iwata would come out with, like, quote him on something he'd said 5 years ago that he'd forgotten about in an instant. But Iwata had hung on to it and thought about it really deeply. And it's interesting as well that Miyamoto is essentially he's an artist. He's a product designer. He comes at games from that kind of way of thinking. Iwata is a programmer, a gifted programmer, apparently one of his generation's most gifted programmers. And he comes at games starting from the technical. And both of them had to learn from the other side of that unique kind of gaming creativity that is both artistic and technical. And they both got a lot from each other in terms of how they thought.
I was surprised how non-traditional their management styles aligned with who they were as people. Because here's Iwata, who is a head of the company, but is known for being very generous with praise, very positive, very fun. And Miyamoto has this kind of, jovial, avuncular, sparkly-eyed, I guess more grandfatherly now image amongst fans. But he has a very different image amongst his, especially younger team members. You have a quote from Nogami in here that said, "I have never once been praised by Mr. Miyamoto," Nogami said, but he had heard positive feedback about himself from Miyamoto that was shared with other people, just not directly to him. No, this is so interesting to me because first I was like, is this a thing that is, Japanese business? But you look at other famous Japanese artists who are also leaders, like Studio Ghibli co-founder Hayao Miyazaki, and his blunt temperament is quite public. It's very established. Why do you think Miyamoto has been able to maintain this more light-hearted public image and kind of have these two personalities?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because Yamauchi is more of that Miyazaki type. You can totally see like Yamauchi being a complete hard ass and everyone being terrified of him, essentially. That seems to be the vibe that you get. And Miyamoto, I think he is quite a avuncular, grandfatherly person as a human being. But I think when he is being a professional, he has a different attitude to things. And it's very funny because when you speak to him in person and you see him in Nintendo Directs and, other footage, he's very thoughtful. He smiles, he laughs. He doesn't love being the center of attention, but he's a guy that you would imagine would be lovely to have read you a story. Do you know what I mean? Like, he's got that kind of lovely energy around him. But I think, he is known at Nintendo, firstly for killing projects and for his very, very harsh feedback on projects. And secondly, he would kind of, there was a while where he was a creative, before he became Nintendo's creative fellow, he would just sort of, the way that Nogami described it to me is kind of like a shark. He'd sort of just go around all of the different teams and just like turn up and just kind of lurk, and everyone would sort of freeze up and he'd sort of play prototypes and say absolutely nothing and then disappear again. And then the feedback would sort of eventually appear. And I think that he developed some principles that he found were very successful for himself. And there's a few of them that have become kind of part of Nintendo legend, like the phrase upending the card table, which is something that Iwata named this process of Miyamoto's, where he would just turn up and go foof, and the whole thing would all fall apart, and he'd be like, start again, but with like a different approach. And there's a few times when you'd speak to other developers, younger developers at Nintendo, and they would describe the experience of presenting an idea to Miyamoto and seeing his face darken and knowing that they were cooked. Eventually Miyamoto would open his mouth and give the feedback, and it would be devastating, and they'd all be on the floor. And you hear that, like, I think every younger Nintendo developer's had that experience at least once. So yeah, it is interesting that there are these two sides to him. But I think he cares so much about quality, like the tiniest little details of games, consoles, controllers. Like, he lights up when he talks about fine details of like the positioning of the C buttons on the N64 controller. So I think he has an almost obsessional approach to quality, and he feels, I think, almost personally offended when things don't live up to those standards. And I think that's partly why his teams have come up with such great things, but I imagine it is quite intimidating to have worked with him, certainly in the 90s and 2000s.
I want to go back to Iwata one last time. And to do that, I think we need to talk about one of his closest friends, colleagues, peers, Shigesata Itoi, who is the director of Earthbound, the founder of Hobonichi, roughly a trillion other things, maybe the most accomplished person to ever walk the earth, and a close friend of Iwata. And they really served as creative sounding boards for each other. In the book, you write about how Itoi, and I believe this is while he is making Earthbound, or maybe Mother 1, its prequel, had said that he wanted gaming to be for grown-ups, kids, and the girl next door, and basically everybody. And that this notion had a really profound impact on Iwata. How did Iwata go about expanding the tent for gaming with Nintendo?
So Iwata, before he worked at Nintendo, he worked at HAL Laboratory, which was obviously a Tokyo developer with Hirai, who went on to make Super Smash Bros. So he, through a sequence of events involving a couple of big misses on the NES and a near bankruptcy, Satoru Iwata ended up as a relatively young man being in charge of HAL Laboratory, working with Nintendo on a bunch of projects, including Kirby, and then being brought into Nintendo. But when he was at HAL, he was known as the guy who could go in and rescue basically any project. So Iwata personally would often turn up, and he rescued Mother, which Itoi was working on. That game was just going nowhere. And what Iwata managed to do was come in, listen to every single person who was working on it, which was a specialty of his. He liked to interview everybody who worked at Nintendo once every few years, just to make sure that he knew every single intricate, tiny working of how things were put together, how the company was functioning, and what everyone's job was. So he came into that project, the Earthbound project, and essentially figured out how to fix it for them, and then helped them to rebuild the code base and then put it back together in such a way as to make it a releasable game. And, Itoi was in awe of this as he tried to finish this game for ages. It just wasn't happening. But then similarly, Iwata was in awe of Itoi as a creative. And as you've pointed out, Itoi was a amazing polymath. He's done a million things in Japan. He's really very famous in Japan as a writer and a bunch of other stuff. But yeah, he had this future-facing kind of attitude. Games were for him just one of the things he did, He wasn't like a programmer. Games were one way of expressing some of his ideas and his thoughts. And so I think that was what had a major impact on how Iwata thought, because they worked so closely on the Mother project, and they exchanged worldviews, and they remained friends throughout their lives until Iwata died. And I think that expanding of who are games for, who makes them, who plays them, I think that was a big moment for him in terms of realizing that in the future, games could be different. They could look different. Different people could play them. And it really committed to this. If you look at the DS and the Wii, which were, of course, two of Nintendo's most successful consoles of all time, but when they were when they weren't released yet, when they were announced, everyone thought they were ridiculous. It was open season on Nintendo in 2005. I remember it so well. The DS was this weird little clunky, dorky thing. You held it like a book. You could write on it. It was for grannies who wanted to do brain training and look after a little dog, It was just, although I think actually Nintendo's was 3DS, wasn't it? But it was a very unusual console, and, gamers genuinely thought it was quite comical and maybe a bit pathetic. But then it turned out that opened the door for so many people who found the touch interface to be very intuitive. And especially in Japan, the DS had all sorts of things that weren't games, other things that it could do. It had all sorts of, you could learn English on it. You could read newspapers and things on it. It had a really wide selection of uses. And also, I think Iwata saw in some series like Animal Crossing, he saw a lot of potential for it to break out of gamer world and maybe become bigger. For Animal Crossing, that didn't really happen until after Iwata had passed away, but he saw the potential for it to happen, which is why it was, a big DS title, and it ended up selling a lot on the DS, largely because Iwata thought this is a game that could expand the gaming population. And he became driven by this idea of expanding the gaming population and welcoming more people into the gaming population and kind of getting rid of this obsession with technological advancement and constantly being on the cutting edge, and instead working on how to welcome more people. There's a very prescient quote of his that I think is in the book, where he kind of goes, there's this idea that gaming is sort of bad for you, that it rots your brain. And he's like, we can make prettier games forever. We can make bigger, more beautiful games. We're never going to change that attitude unless we welcome more people in. And like, until we manage to communicate to people what the joy of games is and like why they're worthwhile and why they're, why we all love them, until we can effectively communicate that, show people, welcome them in, we're never going to get rid of this idea of gaming as this like slightly rotten thing. And it will never be able to progress. And I thought that was really prescient, because he said that in the early 2000s, at a time when, that was still a pretty, that wasn't an opinion you'd hear very often in the gaming world.
I do want to return one last time to Miyamoto and Mario. Miyamoto has said that he wanted Mario to grow alongside the video game medium the way that Mickey Mouse grew alongside animation. How have Miyamoto and Nintendo gone about that over the decades?
This quote happened because he was asked about the fact that American children at one point in a Q Score survey, which was like a market awareness survey in the 90s, they recognized Mario more than Mickey Mouse. And Miyamoto actually felt really bad about that. He was a huge fan of animation. And he was like, no, hang on, Mario's only been about for 10 years. It seems wrong to me that, a character like Mickey Mouse has had all these decades to become the icon that he is. And Mario's only been here for 5 minutes. So Miyamoto actually felt kind of bad about Mario outdoing Mickey Mouse, which is quite something. But yeah, obviously now Mario does have the history and Mario has the chops, as it were, to stand up there with Mickey Mouse or indeed any kind of icon of entertainment, any character from any entertainment anywhere, really. And the way that Mario has been used as a launch pad for new ideas started kind of in the 90s, things like Mario Kart, Mario Paint, and has really continued. Mario is always the first thing Nintendo does in another medium. If you look at the Mario movies, you look at the Nintendo theme park started with Mario. Mario has kind of become the way that Nintendo tries something new. They'll put Mario on it, they'll see if it works, and then they might expand to other things. And obviously we'll see a Zelda movie next. I think it's very funny how Nintendo's movies are following the same historical steps as the games. The Pokemon, obviously a slight bit of an outliner with all the Pokemon movies. But I think that Mario has been cultivated now as I think of him as like a spirit of fun. He's a kind of symbol of toddler-like glee. And the way they've been so careful with the way that he's used, but they've also used him as a launchpad for new stuff. Whenever they branch out from games, whenever they branch out to anywhere else, they use Mario as the way to do that. And I think they've been pretty successful actually in cultivating his image, as it were, as a mascot. I think that they've taken great care of Mario. And of course, Miyamoto's had to hand Mario over now in many ways to other people. And he seems quite sanguine about that. He seems quite happy about it. That he is like a proud parent. He's letting Mario go out into the world and other things are going to happen that he's not in control of anymore. But yeah, I think that a lot of characters just simply get overused and then their cachet diminishes, or they start getting licensed out in such a way as that the products that come out aren't very good, or it dilutes the value. Despite the fact that Mario has been on everything and that not everything that Mario has been in has been good, there's still this kind of power in the fact that almost everything that Mario's on has been like a really good idea. You can still kind of trust Mario, especially for the games. You can always trust that a Mario game is going to be delightful.
I'm pretty sure he's going to live beyond Skibidi Toilet. That's just me. But I can't guarantee anything in this world. I do want to talk more about the future. We'll do that in the bonus section. But first, I want to give you a chance to plug this wonderful book. Can you tell people about how they can go check it out?
Hopefully you should be able to find it at any bookstore in the US, Canada, or the UK, and some parts of Europe. But it's going to be available on, I believe, February 3rd in the US and February 11th in the UK and Canada. And it is available in audiobook, it's available in ebook, and it should be available at pretty much any bookstore that you choose. So please do pick it up. It's my life's work. Nintendo's been my way into video games and a kind of enduring love of mine for all the 20 years I've been doing this job. So I do feel like this is sort of the culmination of everything I've learned so far about why video games are so fascinating and how Nintendo approaches them. I hope it's very enjoyable.
And you read the audiobook, so if people are already charmed by you from the podcast, they can just go right into it.
Yeah, it might get sick of me after 11 hours, but I think I did an okay job.
I get sick of myself after 11 hours, so totally get it. Patreon subscribers, I've got one more section for you. Keza sticks around to talk about the future of Nintendo, what she learned having spoken with the people who actually work there, and a little bit of analysis where she herself sees the company going based off of her decades of experience. It is a great conversation. I think you'll really enjoy it. If you're not a Patreon subscriber, no worries at all. We still have more show for you. We have the news of the week where I will be talking about the end of an era in video games. So, let's split up. Act 3, the news of the week. This week, Ubisoft announced it had canceled 6 games, including a remake of Prince of Persia: Sands of Time. Now, the cancellation is part of a much larger corporate restructuring that will lead to a yet-to-be-shared number of layoffs. And this follows last year's restructuring and layoffs at Ubisoft too, along with perpetual rumors that the company's investors are interested in an acquisition. Ubisoft isn't the only publisher flailing its way through a precarious moment. To show some sympathy here, what's happening to the industry as a whole is far worse than the typical down year of sales or generational shift in popular genres. What we're witnessing is the end of a video game epoch. So, consider this its eulogy. In the early 2000s, the video game industry had consolidated around the power players that would dominate the early 21st century. Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft were the big 3 console makers. Video game publishing belonged in the West to EA, Activision, and Ubisoft. And in Japan, Square Enix, Konami, Capcom, and Sega. By the mid-aughts, Blizzard would come to dominate the MMO space, and Valve would, by the end of the aughts, assert control over PC through Steam. However, the majority of games were still sold through brick-and-mortar retailers, namely GameStop. And thus, equilibrium. For 20 years, these titans lived comfortably alongside each other. Occasionally, one would step over a line and into another space, like Ubisoft and EA and Activision building online gaming marketplaces of their own, but these aggressions would almost always fail, and in short order, everyone would return to something resembling the status quo. By the end of the 2010s, though, some analysts, developers, and press began to sound the alarm. Habits were changing, young people were playing fewer games, and what money they did spend went into free-to-play items and subscriptions. Then came COVID, and suddenly every adult who had ever given gaming a passing glance was stuck in their house playing everything from Animal Crossing to Call of Duty. The financial highs of the pandemic, they were basically a coat of paint over a moldy wall. But now, 6 years later, not only is the mold visible, but it's also spread within the walls. The very structure is fucked. The signs are especially dire amongst companies from the US and Canada. Some of these titans have consolidated further, hoping to find comfort within mega tech giants to weather the oncoming storm. Others have sought protection from foreign wealth funds. All have taken shears to their portfolios, cumulatively canceling dozens of projects and laying off thousands of employees. In Japan, things are, if not reminiscent of the golden age, then at least stable, the industry benefiting from a surplus in creativity, and broadly speaking, a refusal to chase the ill-fated genres like hero shooters and monetization schemes like games as a service that undercut their Western peers. But all corners of the old guard are reckoning with the fact that their era is coming to an end, and a new era with new established titans has begun. The shift can't and shouldn't be tied to any one cause, and yet, if I had to pick a catalyst, it would be Minecraft, a game that was comparably cheap to create, but offered unlimited space for creative expression. Its big-budget contemporaries chased cinema, prizing lifelike visuals, dramatic stories, and incremental power fantasies that placed players into the shoes of superheroes and super soldiers. The games of the new era, they've been established somewhere in this spectrum between the cinematic and AAA of the past, and the relative creative free-for-alls of games like Minecraft. Take, for example, Fortnite, which has the combat and the intellectual property pizzazz, while allowing players to build, destroy, and perhaps most importantly, style themselves however they see fit. Or consider Roblox, a game that saw kids accepting the visual simplicity of Minecraft and discovered that aesthetic could be disregarded altogether, as could assumptions of quality. All that mattered for millions of young players was community. It's not new to say that these forever games are disrupting the status quo. What's different, though, right now in 2026, is the industry-wide sense that the people in power at the old guard have no clue what to do next. Most publishers spent the past decade attempting to create their own versions of these money-printing machines, but they have failed. The CEOs, the investors, and the game directors learned the hard way that putting hundreds of millions of dollars into these games guarantees nothing. Over the past 5 years, Ubisoft's stock value has dropped 90%. Now, I don't know what comes next. In a recent interview with Stephen Totilo at GameFile, the CEO of Nexon, Jung-Hoon Lee, spoke about the incoming third wave of games, one that may even threaten the Robloxes and Fortnites of the world. Says Lee, the boundary between our everyday life and games is becoming more and more blurry, and they're kind of torn down. So I thought maybe that could be a fun kind of space, an area where we can gain some great clue towards what will be the next fun experience. Maybe the old guard will run in this direction, whatever it might be. Or maybe they will do what so many former Titans have done in the past. Run out of ideas, look for ways to cash out through painful layoffs and hurried acquisitions, and disappear. In 1980, Atari was unstoppable. By 1984, it was practically dead. That company serves as the perpetual reminder to an industry led by a narrowing list of absurdly wealthy CEOs that even the biggest monuments will turn to dust. And so, don't be surprised if years from now you stumble upon an ancient press release that reads, "My name is Bobby Kotick, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, in despair." And you find yourself wondering, who the hell was Bobby Kotick? And that is the news of the week. We did it! We learned in the end it really was a him, a Mario. Next week, you have heard of Dragon Quest, but have you played Dragon Quest? For as long as the series has existed, the creators of one of Japan's most beloved franchises have been trying to bring that popularity to the West. And they have more or less failed. Though Dragon Quest continues to grow in reputation amongst American and European gamers, it still plays second fiddle to its sibling from Square Enix, Final Fantasy. And yet, every decade or so, American shores are met with a new wave of Dragon Quest hype. One has just arrived, setting up the release of Dragon Quest XII at some point in the coming year or 2 or 3. Square Enix has been releasing remasters and flashy remakes of both the earliest and the most beloved entries in the series. Dragon Quest 1 through 3 are now available in glorious 2.5D pixel remasters, and in the coming weeks, Dragon Quest VII Reimagined updates the fan favorite into something visually on par with popular AAA RPGs. Can Square Enix finally make Dragon Quest a major mainstream hit? To answer that question, I speak with The Verge's Andrew Webster, who wrote the piece, "The Decades-Long Quest to Make Dragon Quest a Hit in America," in 2017. Yes, he wrote it in 2017, and it is freshly relevant today. Until then, though, a reminder, post-game supporters get the show and the newsletter early on Fridays at 5 p.m. Eastern at the latest, usually quite a bit earlier than that. They get extra acts and bonus materials, This week, Patreon listeners got an extra segment with our guest, Keza McDonald, where we talked about the future of Nintendo. Plus, each month, subscribers get an extra episode in my ongoing series, Past Games, in which I share deep dive histories into the gaming anniversaries of 2026. The upcoming bonus episode, for example, tells the history of the original Animal Crossing, which Nintendo released on the Nintendo 64 25 years ago. And no ads on anything. Subscribe to the Patreon at patreon.com/postgames. Subscribe to the newsletter for free and get show notes at post.games. Postgames logo by James Barham, theme by Mark Sparling, and a special thank you to this week's guest, Keza McDonald. Like the show, please consider leaving a review on Apple or Spotify. It helps a lot. Thank you so much for listening. And now to take us out, a song from Ratcheteer DX, published by Panic. A new demo is now available on Steam. This track is composed by Matthew Grimm, and I think you're really going to dig it.